Greetings, loved ones.
Let's take a journey.
Hey guys, it's Julia. Welcome back to my channel. Today's video idea came to me at like 11 p.m. the other night, which is when I get like my best ideas but also my most cracked ideas, and there's a very thin line between those two. I was thinking about my eyeshadow palette collection right now, and because I'm doing my palette series on Instagram where I'm doing a look with every eyeshadow palette I own, I've been focusing a lot more on what I own. I declutter continually in my collection throughout the year. I am very open about the fact that I form emotional attachments to certain products sometimes, so declutters can be really hard for me. I've done declutters where I've been like really cutthroat, and I've also done declutters on my channel where I've barely gotten rid of anything and the people in the comment section are mad at me. So in today's video, I want to reflect on the eyeshadow palettes that were the hardest for me to declutter and talk about why they were so hard for me to declutter, and then whether or not I regret decluttering them now that we're in the future. Declutter's remorse is such a real thing. Most of you guys probably don't know this, but something I used to do was actually like designer bag flipping. So I would troll eBay and find authentic designer bags for pretty cheap. If they were fixer-uppers, I would take them in and fix them up and then sell them for a profit. And that was like kind of my way of making money in the beginning of high school. Real ratchet entrepreneurship. And through my time of like designer bag flipping, I've been haunted by certain bags where I'm like, oh, I wish I'd like held on to that a little bit more because then I could have gotten a little bit more money out of that profit, or I wish I'd like held on to it for myself because I really loved that bag but I had to sell it because I had to make my money back, etc. And I think sometimes the same thing applies to makeup. I do want to say though, something I've never done that I'm pretty proud of is I've never decluttered something and then rebought it again. I've come close and we'll talk about that later in the video. But as much as I'm like really stubborn about not wanting to declutter things, I also am very stubborn about not going back on that decision once I've decluttered it. So I hope you guys enjoy this video. It's kind of out of the box. I don't know if anyone's ever done this before. I'm wearing my own merch. This is the Rose Flower Child merch, one of my favorites. I'm also drinking Coke Zero out of a wine glass because I am the epitome of class and grace. Full details of this look should already be on Instagram. I've rambled more than enough in this intro and I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get into it. Okay, starting off, a palette that I actually really enjoyed when I reviewed it and honestly didn't have any problems with, but I still decluttered because I just wasn't getting enough use out of it. The Anastasia Beverly Hills Riviera palette. This, I actually did a full dedicated review video on my channel, which I don't do very often, but I really enjoyed this palette. I liked the color scheme overall. I felt like Anastasia did a great job with the quality, and it was also like one of the first, I think, colorful palettes that Anastasia ever came out with. Riviera was their spring 2019 palette, so it was still kind of like this era of exclusivity around Anastasia palettes where like they didn't really come out with that many palettes back then, so like whenever they came out with something it was special and it was exciting. And I love my Anastasia palettes. I do kind of semi-collect them, but I also don't have a collector's mindset where I'm like I need to have every single one of them. I kind of broke that chain anyways when I didn't buy the Sultry palette because I didn't really think it was for me. But my current Anastasia palette collection is the Master Palette by Mario, the ABH Jackie Aina palette, Subculture, the original formula, Soft Glam, Modern Renaissance, and the Norvina palette. These are all palettes I use, I love, and I feel like bring something to my collection that I just don't have in any other palettes. Riviera palette, as much as I really enjoyed the quality of it and the looks I got out of it, I didn't feel like I was reaching for it enough. I felt like I had those colors in other formulas that I liked just as much, if not more, than the Anastasia formula, which is weird because Anastasia's formula is one of my favorites. And that was a very weird feeling for me to reconcile. It just didn't make sense to me that I liked the palette overall, and when I used it, I enjoyed the looks I got out of it, but I just wasn't excited by the idea of using it. And for me, that was kind of the indication that maybe it was time to let it go. So I did end up selling my Riviera palette. It was almost like pretty much brand new, and it was really a rough declutter for me just because I had bought that one fairly recently. It was like I decluttered it within like 6 months of having it, and I honestly like felt kind of ashamed and embarrassed that I was decluttering it so early. Like I felt like I didn't even give the palette that much of a fair chance. But I'd reviewed it, I liked it, and just decided that it wasn't really adding anything to my collection. So that was a hard one for me to get rid of, but I do have to say I haven't regretted that decision at all. Like I haven't missed the Riviera palette. If I want to get looks that I could get out of that palette, I can get them with like a bunch of other palettes in my collection. So it was hard for me to declutter that one, but it's not something that I think about and it's not something I regret. Did I consider trashing and refilming this entire video because of the one strand of hair on my forehead? Yes, I did. Oh my god. By far the most memorable and probably the hardest thing I've ever decluttered was my Pat McGrath Mothership II. It was such a special purchase for me because obviously Pat McGrath's palettes are ridiculously expensive, almost to a point where I feel like they're not really worth it, but they do have a very special formula in them. Particularly her metallic foiled shades, that was the reason I was keeping the palette. There were like 4 really beautiful metallic foiled shades that I think Pat McGrath is really famous for in that palette. And in the other 6 shades in the palette, there were 2 like dark mattes, a dark brown and a dark black, and kind of like satin shades that were meant to be used in the crease, but they had shimmer in them, which is like not my favorite thing. The reason I decided I needed to get rid of it was just because it had like 6 shades I wasn't using, and I was keeping it for those 4 shades. I viewed that palette kind of similar to how I view like a designer bag as an investment purchase. When I buy something like that, I want to be able to like later get my money out of that by passing it along. So a Chanel bag, for example, will hold its value and you can actually sell it for a profit later on because Chanel like hikes the price up of their bags every year. Like palettes aren't the same way. Obviously the Pat McGrath palette was $125 when you bought it and was still $125 and it was still on the market. But at that point I was like, am I really keeping this palette for 4 metallic shades I could probably dupe if I wanted to and probably get a similar effect from other shades in my collection? And once it was out of my collection and I no longer had to like see the palette and know like you're not using that, it was honestly like kind of a relieving feeling, which sounds really stupid. But like yeah, once it was out of my collection I was like, okay, that feels right and feels good. And I haven't since regretted getting rid of that palette. Sometimes I'll be doing a look and be like, Pat McGrath gold would be really good right about now, but then I'm like, you have other golds in your collection, so you're fine. The Too Faced Natural Love palette was a palette that I decluttered in one of my eyeshadow palette declutter videos. And so many people in the comment section were like, you clearly did not want to get rid of that palette, don't get rid of it, you clearly love that palette so much. The reason I'd kept that palette so long was because of the packaging. The packaging is ridiculously beautiful on that palette, and obviously you guys know I love like flowers and butterflies and birds and stuff, but it wasn't really good quality TBH. I feel like Too Faced again is very hit and miss with their quality of eyeshadows. I just never reached for the palette even though it was neutral, approachable colors, because I just felt like the quality was not very fun to work with. So I got rid of that palette, but I haven't regretted it because I actually ended up getting the Too Faced Natural Lust palette. It fills the packaging void in my heart because it's pretty much the same packaging but with a peacock on it instead of a bunny, which is a downgrade, but I'll take it because the shadows in here are actually really good. Again, Too Faced is very hit and miss with their quality. In this palette, they actually included some mattes. That was my biggest problem with the Natural Love palette, was that there were like maybe 4 mattes in the entire palette. In here, there's a good balance of mattes and shimmers. There's also some pops of color, but they're really approachable and very like easy to work within a neutral look, which I think is beautiful. This palette's actually a really great dupe for the Master Palette by Mario by Anastasia if you wanted to get a kind of similar color scheme. And this has filled the void of the Natural Love palette in my heart. So that's a palette I don't regret getting rid of because I found something that filled the big rectangular void in my heart with something a little bit shinier. I don't remember exactly when I made the decision to get rid of these 2 palettes, but I ended up decluttering both of my Ace Beauté Paradise palettes. I had the Classical Paradise, which was this beautiful, like kind of warm-toned, reddish-toned, like very harvest-themed palette. It was like right up my alley in terms of color schemes. I loved, loved, loved that palette. And then I also got rid of the Paradise Fallen, which was one of the most unique color schemes I've ever owned. It was all like deep, rich, very dark eggplant purples. And those palettes, I had such a fun time working with when I had them. I really, really enjoyed the looks I got out of them. Formula was okay, could be sometimes hard to work with just because of the nature of the colors that they picked out. The matte formula is good. I don't like the shimmer formula from Ace Beauté, but I really overall enjoyed those palettes and enjoyed the color schemes. They like inspired me when I looked at them. But I first decided to declutter the Paradise Fallen, the dark purple one, and that was like kind of hard for me, but at some point I realized I don't love the way I look with super, super dark eyeshadow looks on me. I naturally have like pretty small eyes and darker features, and I feel like using really dark eyeshadow colors can just make my eyes look really heavy and weighted down. And it's just, I don't feel comfortable and I don't feel really beautiful with dark eyeshadow looks. So even though I really enjoyed the color scheme in there, I wasn't really reaching for that palette very often. And then the Classical Paradise palette. That palette I decluttered later on. I said I was going to use it in fall and I was going to like keep it until fall, and if I didn't use it during the season, I would then get rid of it. And I didn't use it during fall because I just didn't feel like reaching for it. Again, I don't really like the shimmers in there. And for example, the Alter Ego Aurora palette, this is like very similar in color scheme minus the green to the Ace Beauté palette, and I feel like this formula I just enjoy a lot more. The shimmers in the Alter Ego formula are really, really nice. So I ended up decluttering the Classical Paradise as well, and that one was harder for me to declutter than the Paradise Fallen just because I was like, As a reviewer, I felt the need to keep at least one palette from Ace Beauté, so if I got like questions about the formula, I could reference that palette back. But then I was like, you know what? No, because I have like a brain and I can remember what the formula was like, so I can just pass it along. And also, I'm just like trying to not let that be a reason for me to keep things. Like, yes, I do review products on my channel, but I'm not like a review channel. And I want to keep things in my collection because I like using them and not because I need to have them for a video or something like that. So those two palettes left my collection and I'm pretty chill with it. This was a palette that I kept in my collection for so long, and every time I saw it in my palette stack, I was like, wow, I feel so guilty.
That shit is so disrespectful.
The Colored Raine Queen of Hearts palette. This, ugh. I remember when this was so hard to get because it was not a permanent palette. Now it's like a permanent part of the Colored Raine line. But back when I got it was like the height of its popularity because Colored Raine, I think this was limited edition, they discontinued it, and it was like, you could not find it anywhere. People were selling it for like $200 on Poshmark. I brought it back like briefly. They had like a snap launch and that's when I got mine for like $50 something. It's a pretty expensive palette, honestly. So I got my palette then, and it was so exciting to use every time because I was like, this is a palette that was so sought after. I had it. I'd like search for it high and low, and I really like the formula from Colored Raine. Mattes are like one of the most pigmented, blendable, ridiculously beautiful formulas. The shimmers are gorgeous as well. So I didn't have a problem with the palette itself. The color scheme was kind of similar to my Modern Renaissance palette if there were some like purples in Modern Renaissance. It also kind of reminds me of the Huda Beauty Desert Dust palette, which I'm wearing on my eyes right now. I enjoyed using that palette, but mostly because I felt like accomplished that I'd gotten it, which is like stupid, but I was really living off the hype. And then they brought back the palette permanently because it was so popular, which I think was a probably good decision for them. I just kind of fell out of love with the palette, and overall I still enjoyed the formula a lot, and I still stand by my review of that palette. It wasn't my favorite anymore, but I still like kept it in my collection because obviously, one, it's a beautiful palette, and again, it was the same thing where I was like, I feel like I should keep at least one palette from Colored Raine so I like have their formula that I can reference back to. But at the end of the day, I wasn't using it. I got rid of it, and once it was out of my collection, it just felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest, and I was like, you know what? That was a good decision. I don't regret it. Also, I really haven't seen that palette recently being used by anybody that I watch or like follow on Instagram. I just haven't seen that palette around, so maybe I made the right decision. I don't know. Once upon a time, I was well known for being a stan of the Morphe 39A palette. That palette was really beautiful, and it's obviously like a lot bigger of a palette than I would use today, but I loved the way that palette was laid out. It was just really inspiring for me to look at because the distinctive color schemes, you had like the reddish pinkish corner, you had the like all neutrals and browns, then you had blues, like the deep grungy darker tone blues and olivey greens, and it was one of those palettes that was like colorful but it wasn't rainbow, and that was very hard to find back then. I think the formula was actually really good. It was pretty much like the same formula that I really liked from the Jaclyn Hill original palette, so I really enjoyed that one when I had it, and the looks I got out of it I really liked as well. Once I got my James Charles palette though, again, it's 39 shades, so this is like now the biggest palette that I own in my collection. I feel like this really did fill the niche that the 39A palette had in my collection. I was really only keeping that palette for one shade in there, which was the navy blue color. So I like spent a lot of time searching high and low for a good navy blue single, and I eventually got the Huda Beauty Sapphire palette, which I eventually decluttered as well, but that had the navy blue that I wanted in it. So I was like, you know what, I can get rid of this big ass Morphe palette that's taking up so much space in my collection and feel a little bit better about myself. 39A was hard for me to declutter because, again, at the time, this was a limited edition palette and it was gone by the time that I decided to declutter it. So I was like, if you get rid of this, you can't get another one if you decide that you want the palette again. And they brought it back, obviously, because Morphe doesn't actually have any limited edition products in their collection ever. So this palette, I believe, is like currently available now. I don't know if the formula is the same because they have been changing their formulas a lot. I really love that palette though, and when I got rid of it, I was like, I feel like I'm gonna regret this. And TBH, have not. This one is the closest I've ever come to repurchasing decluttered product. The Tartelette Bloom palette. Ugh! This palette was like up there with the Modern Renaissance in terms of popularity when I was just getting into makeup. There was like a viral Instagram post that went around that had like the Morphe 35O, the Anastasia Modern Renaissance, and then the Tartelette Bloom palette, and it was like, these three palettes are the only palettes that you'll ever need, the best three palettes to ever be created. So I had all three of them at that point. The Modern Renaissance I still own. 35O I decluttered eventually because it's like 35 shades of the same exact brown color. The Tartelette Bloom palette, again, Tarte, like Too Faced, pretty inconsistent with their eyeshadow quality, but the Tartelette Bloom is probably the best palette I've ever tried from Tarte. If you just want good, straight up neutral colors that like you can't really do a ton with, but you also can't really do a lot of bad looks with, I think the Tartelette Bloom palette is really great. It's good for beginners. The formula is like not too pigmented to a point where you can't blend it out, but it's also not like chalk. I decluttered it because like it's one of the most boring color schemes ever. Decluttering it though just didn't feel satisfying like declutters normally do. I felt like gross and I was like, this is not a decision I feel very good about. It's like one of the only palettes I've decluttered that I actively miss sometimes in my collection. It was also very good for travel. Like the packaging is super sturdy. So if, like, for example, I can't travel with Modern Renaissance because that shit will break immediately. So yeah, I came like this close to repurchasing the palette. It was like on sale for $24, I believe, and I was like, you know what? Because I sometimes like every 2 months or so miss this palette in my collection, I should probably buy this. But rational thoughts took over and I was like, you have literally every single one of those colors about 6 times over in your collection, so I think you're good. I do still think about that palette and I do recommend it if you want like a good beginner basic eyeshadow palette, but for me, I don't need it, and I think decluttering it was a smart decision, but just doesn't feel good sometimes. Kind of like the Anastasia eyeshadow palettes, ABH glow kits are like one of my favorite things that I like used to collect in my makeup collection. I currently only have one, the Nicole Guerrero glow kit, which I'm currently wearing on my cheekbones right now, forever young, right up here. I've owned, I want to say like 4 glow kits over time, and now I only have one of them. So obviously 3 of them have been decluttered, but the hardest one by far to declutter was the Moonchild glow kit. To declutter this one, I had to admit something about myself that I really didn't want to, and that's that I am not somebody who can pull off and or wants to wear colorful highlighters. I think I mostly kept this palette because Abby really likes it a lot. She likes the pink heart shade in there, and that is like a beautiful pink highlighter. Problem is, I don't look good in pink highlighters. Like, they look terrible on me. The Nicole Guerrero ones like aren't like aggressively pink toned, so these look fine on me. But the Moonchild palette is like duochrome, like colorful highlighters. The most wearable, quote unquote wearable shade in that palette was the pink shade, and it just did not look great on me. And as much as I love colorful makeup, I'm really not somebody who wears a ton of like green or blue or purple highlighters, so I didn't really get a ton of use out of that palette. Sometimes I would remember to use it in my inner corner when I was doing a colorful eye look, but most of the time I wouldn't, because when I'm doing an inner corner highlight, I usually use something that's inside the eyeshadow palette that I'm using. So yeah, the Moonchild palette did not get really any use, but I was like, I need to keep this just in case I need like a blue highlighter for some reason. And it was hard for me to declutter just because I had to like admit to myself, like, you just don't do colorful highlights, that's just not your thing. But now that I don't have any more, I've had like no compulsion to use a colorful highlighter whatsoever. I'm happy just being that person who wears like champagne highlighters and is fine with it. Like, it's okay. 2 more things. The first, if you break it down by grams and like the amount of product that it had, pretty much the most expensive item of makeup I've ever owned. I had a Charlotte Tilbury quad. I had the vintage Vamp eyeshadow quad, and these palettes are ridiculous. They're $54 for 4 shades. Yeah, I know. I know. You don't have to lecture me. I picked the vintage Vamp one just because it looked like something I would use regularly. There were 2 like kind of matte shades in there, which were kind of like satin and not fully matte, like different shades of burgundy, and then there were 2 like kind of shimmery shades, a gold and then a like pink champagne. The pink champagne shade was like the only shade in that palette that I liked. It was basically your standard foiled shimmery pink toned like neutral shade. Problem is, I have many Colourpop Super Shocks or just other shadows in my collection that do the exact same thing. Gold shade was like super disappointing. It was like a flaky, it was not like an actual gold shimmer, it was more like a gold topper, so it had like little to no pigmentation. It was pretty much just gold glitter pressed into a pan. And the 2 matte shades were like really weirdly patchy. And I don't know if that's just the Charlotte Tilbury formula, if it was because those 2 like shades are burgundies, which are harder to formulate. But that palette really scarred me from trying out Charlotte Tilbury eyeshadows. Now I only have this palette from them, the Look in a Palette, and the 3 eyeshadow shades in here are good, but it's like very difficult to mess up shades like this, so I don't know if that means anything. And then the final thing was the Colourpop Yes Please palette. This, rough times. This was Colourpop's first ever eyeshadow palette, and it was such an exciting thing for me to get because it's a pretty much perfect dupe for the ND Sunset palette, and that was a palette that I really lusted after, so getting the Colourpop palette felt like, ooh, I am filling this void in my heart. That palette sucked. Not the entire palette, but the shades that mattered. The yellow shade, that is pretty much the only color that I didn't have in my collection that I bought the palette for was awful. Like one of the worst ever yellows I've ever used. So that sucked, buying the palette for the yellow shade specifically and then having the yellow be like really not great quality. And then the rest of the shades in there were pretty basic. So I was like, you know what, maybe if I like depot the shades that I want, because Colourpop palettes are magnetic, then I will get some use out of this palette. Let it be known that whenever I depot something, I'm basically sending the palette to die. Like, I will never use those shadows again. If I depot something, it's never being touched ever again. So after I depotted the shades I wanted and I was like not using them, I was like, you know what? It's time. Like, I need to just put the shades back in the palette and get rid of the whole palette as a whole. And now that it's gone, I legitimately do not think about that palette ever, and I kind of forgot that it existed until I was planning on this video. So yeah. Alright, that is it. There were like 3 or 4 more things on this list, but I cut them off because I'm done filming this video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Make sure you are subscribed down below. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. And if you made it to the very end of this video, I love you. You get the bonus meme, and also I will see you on Monday with some new merch. But until then, love you. Bye.
Hey, somebody come get her, she dancing like a stripper. Somebody come get her, she dancing like a